a lot of kids have a very deep need for fairness. And it feels unfair to them. It doesn't matter if it is or not. We have to address the feeling that they have and help them learn to navigate what's going on.
You're listening to Parenting with Impact, the podcast for parents like you, raising complex kids to become capable, independent adults, even in this complicated world. Each episode brings expert insights and real-life strategies to help you parent with confidence, calm, and clarity. Here are your hosts, Elaine and Diane.
Welcome back, everybody, to another conversation in the Parenting with Impact podcast. So Diane and I were just talking about what to talk about today, and we realized we've never done an episode about siblings.
Well, and true story, today we're going to interview for a summit that's specifically focused on siblings. And so it was a great sort of thing. It's like, okay, well, what do we want to talk about? So we're going to share some of this stuff with you guys as well.
Well, but then I was just talking to somebody just in the last week about, and this issue comes up about, is my younger kid really dealing with the same issues as my older kid, or are they mirroring and mimicking the older kid's challenges? So,
wow.
All right.
So let's back up and say, like, what are some of the key challenges? Let's just kind of riff them off for a second and then dig into them. Like, so
okay,
I see
sibling issues with complex kids.
Right.
Go.
Riffing. Like, one is sibling fights and intensities and that sort of stuff. Two is like you've got kids, like an older kid who's neurospicy and a younger kid who's not. And so there's more responsibility that the younger kid can take than the older one. And the younger one says it's not fair or you don't know how to handle it. The one sibling is taking up all of the energy of all the parents. And so they don't have time for the other kid and they feel like they're left out. The one you mentioned was
mirroring is the older kids' issues.
Right. What do you do if your kids' issues are different than each other and they really, and they're both neurospicy, but they're different flavors of neurospicy?
Right. And often there's the issue of because one's taking up a lot of energy in the space, there's this sense from the parents that the other kid's not getting the attention they need.
Okay. So are there any other big buckets? And then we can dig into
There's one more, which is my neurotypical kid is blaming me for the way I'm parenting my complex kid. Is blaming the parent.
Okay. Yeah.
You're not being fair. You're not doing well enough. You're not right. And so the mom or the dad is trying to meet the kid where they are and based on their needs, and the sibling is criticizing the parenting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
That makes sense. Okay.
That's a lot of issues. Wait, can we just have a minute?
It's a lot of stuff.
So let's set the context again. You've got 3 kids.
Mm-hmm.
I've got 3 kids. All of our kids have varying degrees of neurospiciness. And here's the thing about neurodiversity is that they all show up differently.
Yeah.
Right? So that when you have multiple children, you're not dealing with, well, if they've all got ADD, it looks like this. You're dealing with, this is how it shows up for this kid, and this is how it shows up for that kid.
Well, it is really funny because I was thinking about this a little bit this morning, and like, so 2 trains of thought. One is I now have grandkids, and one is 6, and one is a newborn. And like, even there's sibling stuff already, right? And I think that sibling stuff is universal. I always joke, I'm going to go spend the weekend with my older sibling, and I'm excited about doing that. But when I was growing up, I used to say, one used to beat me up and one would tell on me. I was the only daughter. I was in the middle, and there was always dynamic. And so there is typically some sort of sibling dynamic that happens. And I think 2 things happen when you have a neurospicy family. One is neurospiciness always adds extra flavor to whatever dynamic you're talking about. And I think that as parents, we sometimes become differently vigilant to what's going on between our kids, particularly if one is neurospicy and one is not, or one requires more energy from us than the other. And so we do add a layer of vigilance where, I don't know whether one of my brothers was my mom's favorites or not, or whether I was her favorite or not. I saw, there was always the rumor and the suspicion. And I think that as parents of neurospicy kids, we probably are a little bit more vigilant to that because our kids demand more of our attention.
And energy.
And energy, yes. Both of
There's this, there's this play. My three kids, and so we'll talk about this in the second half of the episode about how do you help foster a sense of team in the family. But my kids are like puppies, like they're very very close as young adults. And one of their favorite jokes is who's the favorite.
Mhm.
But for them, because they're close, it's a joke, not a competition,
Mhm.
right? But the dynamic is always going to be still there, whether they are connected and supporting each other through it or fighting with each other through it. There's always this vying for attention that happens when you have multiple kids.
Yeah.
And you can't, I love that what you said. Sibling stuff is universal, period, in story. And it's always interesting. I don't know if you've had this experience working with clients. I've been thinking about this one client I have where the dad has multiple siblings and the mom was a single child. And her reaction to the sibling issues is so different because she was a single child. So that's another theme we
That's
did.
a whole other variable, right? And
Right.
I've got stories about that too. I'm not gonna, it's just there's all of this stuff is out there, and we're talking about relationships. We're talking about helping kids who have needs that may be different, helping kids that have needs that can be different, period, right?
Right.
And how they relate to each other, right? It's just sort of there's an aspect of this that links back to the drama triangle stuff. Let's put a link back into the drama triangle podcast episode. But, what is our role when our kids are bickering or fighting or arguing? How do I want to be with that? And I think so if we go backwards and say, let's look at a few of those key areas of challenges and just talk about them one at a time. So the first one we were just saying that sibling stuff happens, period. And I think the first thing I want to kind of talk about is like, what is our role as a parent with regard to sibling stuff? And this ties back to the drama triangle. But it's so hard as a parent, especially if we had conflict in our family when we were growing up, to not like be hungry for our kids to get along every minute. I want my kids to be best friends, right? It's a sort of, I hear this from clients all the time. I want my kids to be best friends. I'm best friends with this sibling. I love my sibling. I want my kids to have the same opportunity that I had. Or I've had this broken relationship with my sibling who happened to be neurospicy, and I don't want my kid to have that. Here's the deep breath point, parents. Your kids can hate each other for 30 minutes or for 2 years and still have
Still
a
loving.
really effective, loving relationship, right? It's true. It's possible. I think about, again, my siblings. I was close at different ages. I've been differently close to each of them because our interests line up
Like,
or our
circumstances.
practical lifestyles, or we both had kids at the same time. And so we had to talk about it and we were complaining about our kids together, right? It's a sort of, there's always going to be this thing. And your kids have to figure it out. We can't figure it out for them, is the kind of
Well,
line.
I'm going to argue that let's talk about that again when we
Yeah.
get to solutions
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I have
sorry.
a take on it. So we'll play with that a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what I've heard so far. Sibling stuff is universal. There's
Mhm.
always going to be a dynamic, and siblings they're gonna have conflict, right? That is part of what it is to be a sibling. And when we talked, there's an episode where we talked about how sometimes it's really helpful for kids to have different parents because they learn to navigate different relationships in life.
So
But
have the parents differently. Not
right.
that we all have different
Yeah,
parents.
yeah, right. How to parents who parent differently. And the same is true for siblings. Siblings are the relationships in your lives that help you learn to navigate different kinds of people. Like it's really helpful to foster relationship. And so like it's gonna have some conflict because life has that. And so ideally they're gonna learn to navigate conflict a little bit because they have siblings, because the conflict's gonna be there.
So then let's talk a little bit about differences and different needs, because I think that's the other big area and theme that we identified is like one kid is neurospicy, one's not. The other one's judging you because you're being unfair or you're causing the problem, or there's this sort of, the kids are really different and have different needs, and it's causing conflict between the siblings.
Yes, you've just identified that so well. And there's so many pieces of it. So I think what you're saying is there's the normal, typical conflict that happens with having siblings and different dynamics and who's the favorite and I want your attention and competing for, and that's not fair, right? That's your normal, typical sibling stuff. And what you're saying is, how does that get impacted when there's complexity in the family, right? When one of the kids has neurodiversity, when multiple kids have neurodiversity or other kinds of medical conditions, what happens when there is additional need that influences that dynamic?
Right. So great example is I've got a client with an older kid who has really big emotions, like big emotions where there's physicality sometimes. There's still a young kid and they're working on helping the kid to navigate their big emotions without getting physical. But frankly, they seem like a little bully. When mom's watching this kid, he's like a bully to his little sister. And it's really hard to watch. And this mom wants to protect the little sister from the bully, and we want to, this shouldn't be happening, and he's got to, stop being such a bully, and all of that stuff is like one dynamic that I notice.
Yeah, well, and I was just my adult kids were talking about how much my oldest was bullying the youngest when they were kids that I didn't even know about, right? So I thought I was protecting, but there's only so much you can do. So there's this issue of when the complexity is actually directly impacting the younger kid is part of what you're saying, or the other kids, because it could be younger, could be older. There's also the issue of what happens when it's the parents' attention on, like one of my kids required a lot more of my attention. And because of that, the other two didn't get as much of my attention a lot of the time. And that was just the reality of it. Rick Lavoie used to say, the stuck wheel gets the grease because it needs the grease.
Right.
Right. So sometimes some kids are going to, and usually in most families, I think it changes over the years. So some kids get more attention at this time, some at that time. But when you've got a really complex kid, it's very often that's the kid that's constantly getting attention.
Well, and part of that is might be a kid who's really saying, Mom, Dad, I feel like I'm like over here in the sidelines without any help. And it may also be sometimes that ends up in our head, that we have this story that we're afraid that we're not treating our kids equally, fairly, because one of their kids does need more attention.
Right. Well, but I don't even think it's that we're afraid we're not. I think sometimes we're not. And we have to be honest that my line with my kids was always, everybody's going to get what they need, but everybody doesn't need the same thing. And I was very, very clear, and I think maybe this is how I learned to navigate this dynamic, was I had to make sure that I was meeting everybody's needs, good enough. But if I tried to do everything the same for everybody, I was never going to make it. Right.
Well, here's a simple example of that, because I have one kid who's an introvert and I have one kid that is an extrovert, right?
Yeah.
And so they'd come home from school, they'd get off the bus. My two younger kids are about the same age. My older kid is like 15 years older. But so they come off the bus, and the one kid would need complete attention for 30 minutes to unravel from the day because they were so excited and overwhelmed and extroverting, and they needed me to be able to be there sitting with them for 30 minutes after school. The other one was fine to be up in their room by themselves, reading a book, playing a game. Please leave me alone, right? And was this one getting 30 minutes more time with mom? Absolutely. And they needed it in a different way.
That's right. All right, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to come back.
Do you recognize current ADHD interventions fall short? At DIG Coaching, we have developed a new field of engineering and a new ADHD intervention called Cognitive Ergonomics from the Inside Out. To learn more, visit cognitive-ergonomics.com.
Welcome back, everybody. We are talking about siblings, and Diane, as we're having this conversation, I'm realizing we could do like 10 episodes.
We could.
Much here, we can't.
And it's hilarious that we haven't done one yet, but now we're trying to fit it all into one. So we can slow out and give it as much time as we want.
But here's what I think we've talked about so far. I think we've kind of normalized that sibling dynamics are going to happen in neurotypical families or not. that the dynamics are going to be different when kids have neurodiversity, when there's complexity. And that sometimes that means that one kid is going to take up more time and energy than others. Maybe that will be varying across the years, and maybe it won't. And we have to begin to think as an adult, how do I meet the different needs or challenges? What I see happening a lot in families, and I'm curious if you've had this experience, is, a family will come work with us because one of the kids is really, really, really intense, right? Once we've done some coaching with them and they've kind of calmed things down in the home, now another kid issues are showing up that weren't showing up before, because sometimes the sibling will kind of overperform or protect so that the parent can deal with that really complex kid. And then once that issue levels out, then all of a sudden this kid's anxiety shows up, or their ADD shows up, or their learning disabilities show up, because now they can say, help.
Well, and I would say it's not just when there's intensities. I think that happens a lot. I'm just thinking of a couple who was working at a college age kid who was really struggling in college, and they really worked hard to kind of get them to a place where they were doing okay in college. And then all of a sudden, the kid who was 4 years older pops up and says, I'm really struggling, right? It's just sort of, it's that. And sometimes it's us noticing that our other kid is struggling, but because this kid is struggling, how often does this happen in neurospicy land? Well, my kid is not really, 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 really bad, so I must be okay.
Or it's better, so it must be okay.
That must be okay, right? That's really normal human behavior, and breaks our heart, honestly, whenever we see that.
Yeah. All right. So we want to address how do you support siblings effectively? I do want to make sure we hit that issue of that when a kid is blaming the parent, right?
Yeah.
So how do we improve this situation? How do we foster the healthiest environment when you have complex kids and siblings? That's
so the tool, and I think it's universal, and it's particularly good in the instance you gave then, which is like, Mom, Dad, it's your fault that you're spoiling this one, or you're treating this right. It's just sort of, they're pointing the finger at you. So the reminder is that the blame game is a dysregulated response, right? This kid is frustrated or overwhelmed or feeling let down or sad or whatever. There's some emotion there. I mean, most of us don't go to the blame game unless there's an emotion involved. And it's so easy for us as parents to kind of just flip it and go, oh, no, I love you just the same. You're still important to me, blah, 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 because we don't want them to feel that way, right? But the tool we teach is ACE.
Is acknowledgement, right?
Acknowledgement and validate. ACE stands for acknowledge, validate, and then you wait.
Compassion.
There's a acknowledge, validate, show compassion, and then you wait. There's a dash, and then you explore. So with this, it might be, yeah, I can tell you're really upset about the way that I'm handling this, and that you feel like I'm not being fair, or that you feel like this is all my fault, that your brother's behaving XYZ, right? It's just sort of acknowledging and being with your kid and saying,
their experience is real.
Their experience is real. It doesn't mean I agree with you. Doesn't mean I see it the same way, but we want to make sure that our kids know that we see their experience and we believe that it's their experience.
Well, and this is something we talk about a lot in a lot of our trainings and coaching, but I want to be really, really clear. You can acknowledge your child's experience, their feelings or their thoughts about what's going on without agreeing with them, right? This is really important, that we can acknowledge it. I can see how it feels that way for you. I can see how you would interpret it that way. It makes perfect sense that, right?
And that's hard for two reasons. One is that it takes language crafting. And believe me, I've spent a lot of
work
trying to figure out how to say things compassionately and not make it sound like I'm, complicit or agree or whatever it happens to be. And if our kids are coming to us and blaming us for something, chances are we're going to get defensive and we're going to get dysregulated. And when we're dysregulated and upset and, oh my gosh, they think that, and oh, this is terrible, right? We're going to be reactive. And when we're reactive, it's going to be hard for us to pull out that little compassion tool, differently hard to pull out the compassion tool.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say is when the kids are doing that, it's a great opportunity to look at the situation and say, okay, what's the truth here? What is there here that I might pay attention to? And what does this kid need that they're not getting? Yeah. Right? Because a lot of kids have a very deep need for fairness. And if it feels unfair to them, it doesn't matter if it is or not, we have to address the feeling that they have and help them learn to navigate what's going on.
So then the second, is that enough on the first?
Yeah.
The second one is about our role in their conflict, right? It says we're talking about the fact that how normal conflict is, how normal sibling dynamic is. And I remember very distinctly when my kids were little, because my kids are only 17 months apart, my little ones. And it was hard when they were really little ones because they would fight over everything. And I remember one parenting book is like, whatever you do, don't pull one of them out and point the finger at one of them, right? The conflict is in the relationship. And so the language I would use is something like, wow, it sounds like it's getting pretty hot up there. Do you need help navigating your argument? It sounds like you're arguing. Do you need help? It sounds like, right, it's this sort of, even if I could tell that one of them was the instigator, I was still really careful to hold the fact that the conflict was between the two of them and not just one of them, because it really does take two people to come to any argument, even if one person tends to be more of an aggressor, an instigator, that sort of thing. What would you add, Elaine?
So what you're describing is a way to avoid that tendency to begin to become the protector of one kid over another, because that's going to just reinforce the competitive dynamic instead of fostering the kind of team dynamic that you want. If you're always saying you can't speak to your sister that way, you can't do that to your brother, your sibling is really like, then of course the kid's going to feel like you're always taking their side and you're always on their team, because you kind of are, right?
Well, and ultimately what you're going to want to do is to help your kids to set agreements and boundaries. When we get mad at each other, it's not okay to call each other names. It's not okay to hit each other. I mean, it's like, I know when you've got littles, it's hard to do that. And you want to set that, but you want it to be an agreement in the family.
Yeah. And it's something that becomes...
that everybody does, and not just the one who happens to be doing it at the moment. It's a sort of, our rule is, as a family, when we get angry, what is it that we want?
How we handle it.
Yeah.
Right. And code words are great for that too.
Yeah.
So what's coming up for me as we're having this piece of the conversation, again, is what I said earlier, is that the value that I brought to the family and that I really communicated, you are all going to get your needs met. And I commit to you, I promise to you, you can count on me to make sure your needs get met. And we're going to have to sometimes figure out how to do that. Code words, there's probably a link to somewhere, and we'll look for it. But code words are a great way to help families navigate and set reasonable expectations and agreements for how to handle it when something isn't going well, and it's a pattern you can begin to recognize. So that's something to come back to.
So then the third thing, Elaine, you really want to talk about is like, how do you create an environment where kids are going to be more on each other's team?
So, before I started coaching, when I first started coaching, I did some work with Hal Runkle, who does scream-free parenting. And one of the things he talked about, and he and I had a lot of debates about where it applied to complex families and where it didn't. But one of the things I liked that I think was very useful for complex families was this notion that we as parents can create a team energy. Like in our family, we go by the TKs. And Taylor Klaus is long, so we're the TKs. And in the TK family, we support each other. We go to each other's events. We, whatever it is. And there was this family energy of, we're TKs, and this is what we do as TKs. And so the notion was that you have a value around family connection, family teamwork, family working together, that if you kind of create the vision and hold the vision for that value and help them see how you do it, rather than you need to go to, this is what we stand for as a family. And when we have that clear value, our kids begin to absorb it. What would you say?
Well, as I'm listening to that, there are edges to that, right? Because there are times I think about a couple that I'm working with, and they're a neurospicy kid who has really difficult time with crowds. Right?
Yeah.
And so
absolutely,
this kid cannot go to the game, right? And be there and cheering. And it can be a conversation that says, okay,
how do you want
to? We don't expect that you can come to the game. Can you come to the game with headphones? Yes or no? Can you, can I record the game and you'll watch it later with the volume off? Can we, what can we do that will create a sense of you supporting your sibling that feels okay to you? Right. And I think that that's the piece of it, is that we want to meet our kids where they are. And the way
Right.
I show that I care about my sibling maybe completely differently than the way that you show that you care about your sibling. And we want to try to help our kids figure out their way in it instead of figuring out how to do it our way. I don't know
Yeah.
how else to say that.
No, I think that's great. For those of you who are in either Lifeline or group coaching or premium or whatever, there's a really good, it's an old workshop, but a really good one on family meetings that I would recommend. Um, and so I'll make sure I capture that.
There might be an article on that too. I don't know.
I'll look for it. But I think this notion we're really saying is that we set the value, we foster a sense of team, we work with them to figure out how it shows up for them. And that doesn't mean there's not going to be conflict. But the thing that came up as you were saying that I really want to share is, as a mom of 3 kids who are really, really close now, really, really close, the hardest thing I deal with now is the way that they kind of team up against us.
Yes.
So I want to say the mark of if what you want, and what the other thing we used to say to our kids all the time is, you are the longest relationships you're ever going to have in your life. You're going to be in relationship with each other long after we're gone. Oh, you're never going to die, Mom. Of course I'm not. And this is the longest relationship you're ever going to have. And so that was another way of fostering that. So when they start teaming up against you, remember that's good, because that means they're a team.
Yeah.
You
And you
feel
want them to
each
be a
other as a
team,
team.
even if it feels like you're suddenly an outsider. No, we have
Right.
for that
Like,
going on our
now that they're older and we're going someplace and we need 2 cars, they're like, well, kid's car. And my husband and I are like, wait, I don't want to be in that car.
Well, when we used to send you off to the kids' table at Thanksgiving, you were all mad, and now you want to be alone.
Now you want to be there. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, I know we need to wrap. I want to talk to one more thing that I think is really important, pulling back to the larger context. Okay. And we didn't deal with the single child versus multiple. So that might be another episode. But the larger context is, families have a tendency, better than anybody else in the world, of holding people to who they used to be instead of who they are now.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Families really make it hard sometimes. And if you've ever gone back to your family for Thanksgiving or Christmas or a holiday and felt like, oh my God, they're treating me like I'm 12, you know what I mean.
Yes.
Part of what we have an opportunity to do in our families with conscious family parenting, which is what we're talking about here, is to allow our kids and encourage our kids to see their siblings as people who grow and change, and that it can get better. And we want to acknowledge that and help them see that and give them points for when they do something nice for their sibling, but really make that conscious effort not to hold them to their worst behavior, but to hold the vision for their best behaviors and for who they're becoming.
Well, and the piece that I want to add to that is about resentments, because a lot of times, I mean, a lot of these kids are in difficult relationships with their siblings, and
Yeah.
it does create resentments, and it does create harmful feelings. And, whether it's little T trauma, big T trauma, whatever it is, if we're not helping our kids to navigate that first and go, wow, it makes sense. You're really angry and frustrated about how your sibling treated you for years. It's going to be hard to just forgive and forget. And so there's 2 parts of it. It's like encouraging our kids to do their own work and encouraging our kids to give their siblings permission to have done their work and to have changed and have grown and to be different.
Yeah. And this is sophisticated stuff to expect kids to be able to do. And that's what emotional intelligence is about, right? That's what the coach approach, I think, does in terms of cultivating emotional intelligence. Kids will rise to the occasion when you give them the opportunity, when you presume their competence and their capacity. And no, they may not get it with the nuance that you would get as an adult, but they are feeling human beings, and they really want to be in connection with their parents and their siblings more than anybody else in the world. And they want an access point, a way to feel safe in those dynamics. And so part of really what we're talking about in the big picture is understanding the dynamic well enough to foster a sense of safety and cultivate the trust. Just like in the independence pyramid, when we talk about with your kids, relationship is the foundation and then trust and then communication. The same is true for siblings, and we can guide them into that process.
And what you said, you guide them into that process. There's a energy of holding it lightly that I want to just leave us with, because it's so easy to go, oh my gosh, this feels scary sometimes, and it feels critical sometimes, and
it's important.
It feels really, really, really important. And the lighter we hold it, the more effective we are at really identifying what the real issues are, and when it's important to take action, and when it's important to kind of just let it play out a little bit.
With love, support, and a trusting, safe environment.
Yep.
That was a great conversation. Thank you, Diane. I love that. Okay, folks, as you're listening, take a moment. We talked about a lot. This was a long episode. What are you taking away from it? What had your attention? Was it your siblings? Was it your kids and their sibling dynamic? Like, what really was holding your attention throughout this conversation? And what's your aha or your insight from it? What are you taking away? What's your awareness? And based on that, is there some action you want to do? Is there a conversation you want to have? Maybe with a co-parent, maybe with one of your kids. Maybe there's
you want to call your brother.
Right?
You.
And just understand that this is an evolving process of relationship, and relationships happen over time. It's not a one-time moment, right?
And as always, thank you for what you do for yourself and your kids. At the end of the day, you really do make a difference.
Take care, everybody.
You've been listening to the Parenting with Impact podcast with Elaine and Diane. For more information on the Impact Parents community or to join Sanity School for Parents, please visit impactparents.com. If you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with friends who need similar guidance and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.